We human beings are storytelling creatures. It's deep in our nature. It is far and away the preferred method that we human beings have for taking in data and information. Stories make us laugh, they make us cry, they make us murderous, and they can drive us to acts of heroism. Stories can even define us and shape us. And this is a very deep well. I've spent a lot of time thinking about stories and how stories work. And the thing that impresses me is how little I know compared to what there is to know about stories and storytelling. But I love running workshops as part of my communication skills training on stories and storytelling. And I hope that even though we're working virtually, you will take a lot away from this that will really inspire you and help you to see communication in a different way, or give you some new tools. That's my hope, that's my plan anyway. When I work with scientists, I often come across this anxiety, which is this. Scientists may say something like this: you know, we love stories, we love consuming stories just as much as anybody else, but stories are about making stuff up. And what we're about is data, about empirical evidence, about figuring out how things are, about getting closer and closer to the truth. So we've got no room there for making stuff up. Well, I don't see it like that at all. I'm certainly not suggesting that you start making things up. But storytelling as a tool is an incredible way to enhance your communication and significantly increase the impact that you make on your audiences as you start to tell the stories of science. In this workshop, I'm thinking about stories and storytelling in two very distinct ways. They are related, but it's important to see the distinction. So the use of illustrations and examples, anecdotes, analogies, events from our lives, all those kinds of things count as stories. And of course we should use them. Of course we should tell stories, and we should find better ways to use stories as vehicles for our communication, for our message. So I can give you an example of this. This is a book by Mark Miodownik. Mark is a professor of materials science at University College London. He's passionate about material science. Most people do not run out to the shops to buy the latest book on metals or concrete or plastics or new materials. We're generally not likely to do that. But Mark is passionate, and he's got a mission to fascinate other people, and he succeeds very well in this book. I don't have shares in this book, by the way, but it is very good. The relevant thing for us is that he uses stories all the way through. And this is how he begins a book on material science. As I stood on a train bleeding from what would later be classified as a 13-centimetre stab wound, I wondered what to do. It was May 1985, and I just jumped onto a London tube train as the door closed, shutting out my attacker, but not before he had slashed my back. The wound stung like a very bad paper cut. I had no idea how serious it was. But being a British schoolboy at the time, embarrassment overcame any sort of common sense. So instead of getting help, I decided the best thing would be to sit down and go home. And so bizarrely, that is what I did. To distract myself from the pain and the uneasy feeling of blood trickling down my back, I tried to work out what had just happened. My assailant had approached me on the platform, asking me for money. When I shook my head, he got uncomfortably close, looked at me intently, and told me he had a knife. A few specks of spit from his mouth landed on my glasses as he said this. I followed his gaze down to the pocket of his blue anorak, into which his hand was stuffed. I had a gut feeling that it was just his index finger that was creating the pointed bulge. Then another thought crept into my mind. Even if he did have a knife, It must be so small to fit in that pocket that there was no way it could do much damage. I own penknives myself, and I knew that such a knife would find it very hard to pierce the several layers that I was wearing. My leather jacket, of which I was very proud, my grey wool school blazer beneath it, my nylon v-neck sweater, my cotton white shirt with obligatory striped school tie, half knotted, and cotton vest. A plan formed in my head. Keep him talking, and then just push past him onto the train as the doors were closing. I could see the train arriving and was sure he wouldn't have time to react. Funnily enough, I was right about one thing. He didn't have a knife. His weapon was a razor blade wrapped in tape. This tiny piece of steel, not much bigger than a postage stamp, had cut through 5 layers of my clothes, and then through the epidermis and dermis of my skin in one slash without any problem at all. When I saw that weapon in the police station later, I was mesmerised. I'd seen razors before, of course, but now I realised that I didn't know them at all. I had just started shaving at the time and had only seen them encased in friendly orange plastic in the form of a Bic safety razor. As the police quizzed me about the weapon, the table between us wobbled and the razor blade sitting on it wobbled too. In doing so, it glinted in the fluorescent lights, and I saw clearly that its steel edge was still perfect, unaffected by its afternoon's work. Then a million questions poured out. How is it that this one material does so much for us, and yet we hardly talk about it? It is an intimate character in our lives. We put it in our mouths, use it to get rid of unwanted hair, drive around in it. It is our most faithful friend, and yet we hardly know what makes it tick. Why does a razor blade cut while a paperclip bends? Why are metals shiny? Why, for that matter, is glass transparent? Why does everyone seem to hate concrete but love diamond? And why is it that chocolate tastes so good? Why does any material look and behave the way that it does? So, do you want to know more about material science? I hope so. If that book doesn't make you want to know more, then I don't know what will. Mark skillfully uses illustrations throughout his book, and this is the first way in which I'm thinking about stories and storytelling, the value of stories and storytelling. Stories as vehicles for ideas, stories that draw us in, stories that spark our imagination, that make us ask questions, stories that fascinate us, and so on. If they're used well, stories are just wonderful vehicles that contain ideas. The ideas are the passengers inside the stories. But there's another way in which we think about stories, and we're going to look at that in the rest of this workshop. What are the elements of a good story? What is it that makes a story work? When we're constructing a piece of information using storytelling skill, what are the elements that it has to have in order to fascinate, to hold the audience, and to make them want to know more? The first thing we should talk about is conflict. At the heart of every story, somebody wants something and something stands in their way. Journalists, very often, when they say, "What's the story?" what they mean is, where is the frustration? Where is the conflict? Who's at each other's throats? All stories are based on conflict. So somebody needs something, desperately needs something, would like to have something, and they are frustrated. And we go with them. We follow with them on that path to try and have that tension resolved. It doesn't always have to be blowing up and chasing and shooting, of course. The phone rings. This is an American story. A woman picks up the phone, a young woman picks up the phone, and her best friend is on the phone, except he's a guy who lives on the other side of the country. And she goes, "Hey, how are you?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm just great, thanks. I'm getting married." And she goes, "Wow, that's incredible. Who's the lucky lady?" And they have the conversation. He says, "I want you to be my best woman. I want you to come to the wedding, be my best woman." Okay. And she goes, it would be my honour, it'd be my pleasure. And she puts the phone down. And as she puts the phone down, she realises that she doesn't want some other woman marrying him. She wants to marry him. And she's going to go to the wedding in order to break it up. She wants something. In this case, it's Julia Roberts. And she wants to marry Dermot Mulrooney. And he's intent on marrying Cameron Diaz. So it's not going to go all that smoothly, but it's the conflict that really drives that story. As we shall say again, science is all about overcoming frustration and conflict. We want to know something, something stands in our way and stops us finding out. And it's reaching for ingenuity and drawing on stamina and other resources that science manages to progress. Now, you can't have conflict if you don't have characters, at least one character to yearn and long and struggle and strive against the weather or a mountain or probably other characters. And of course, the job of any good storyteller is to bring characters to life, to describe them a bit, to help them live a little bit for us, to give them some depth. And so we're used to seeing accomplished actors on our screens filling out characters that were, before they got to them, simply described on the page of a shooting script. But we human beings have a long tradition telling stories about non-human characters, about animals, the deeds and activities of animals. Homer, 6,000 years ago, was telling stories about the weather, what the wind wanted, what the rain wanted, what the waves wanted. So if we can do that, why can't we tell stories about beans? What beans want? What about what a molecule of water wants? What about a neuron? What about a spinal cord? What about a brain? What about some kind of a bug? There are all kinds of things that can feature as characters in our stories, and we need to flesh them out. We need to give them some depth. We need people to be able to truly see them and understand them in some way. And however we design our characters, they must be the vehicles to carry ideas. We need to feel their frustrations. We need to feel their conflict, and we need to want them, in some sense, to succeed or to be stopped. The horror writer Stephen King wrote a great book called On Writing, and it's part biography and it's part about the art of writing and storytelling. And he tells this story from very early on in his career when he was working with a newspaper, and he did some copy and it came back all covered in red ink, and the editor, the kindly editor, sat him down and said to him, now look, what you have to know is this: whatever is the story, that's what we keep. Whatever isn't the story, that's what we get rid of. Now, he wasn't being sarcastic. It is extremely important advice to stay focused on what it is that you want to say. But too little detail means that we can't get a good picture of what's being talked about. Too much detail can be incredibly boring. And if you do lots of editing like I do, you listen to interviews that people do, and in your head you've got a script running and it's saying this: boring, 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 great, boring, boring, great, cut that, keep that. Because we're looking out for the details and the facts that are relevant to the story and that are engaging and interesting. So storytellers have an interesting relationship with detail. Bringing a character to life involves giving a little bit of detail, not boring detail, but fresh detail, detail that's going to help us sense this character just a little bit more. Strangely as well, against what I've just said, sometimes when we're talking about something quite abstract, detail can add colour to a story which isn't strictly necessary in terms of the facts, but can help to bring the character that we're talking about, the thing that we're talking about, to life. All stories involve emotion. They play on our emotions. They appeal to our emotions. We've already talked about that. The whole idea of the conflict is that we identify with the conflict, that we start to want for that 2 hours or whatever of the film, or that time we spent reading the book, we feel the tension. We want to have that tension resolved. And emotion, of course, doesn't have any place in scientific research. Now, I know, of course, scientists can be very emotional, and I know there's an awful lot of emotion associated with science. But when we strip it down to its purest state, what we want when we're doing research is to be emotion-free. We want to either compensate for our emotions or remove emotions completely, so that we can establish things to be true independently, objectively, away from human emotion interfering with that. But I'm not actually talking about research. I'm talking about research. And when you're talking about science, you're in the realm of storytelling. And if you're in the realm of storytelling, you're talking about emotion. Because of the mirror neurons and everything, even an emoji evokes emotions in us. We know that if we were to stare long enough at this emoji, then it would have an impact on our brain activity, perhaps on our blood chemistry, and so on. How much more if we look into a human face that seems to be full of emotion? We can't help it. And it's that not being able to help it that makes the fact that emotion is such an important component of story. One of the jobs we have to do very early on in the storytelling process is to make our audience care. Why would they care about the conflict or the frustration of our character? And of course, this is the role of emotion, and it's also tied up with the way we describe the problem, the main character, the main issues. Human beings are drawn in very easily and quickly into stories. We all are, but you have to do it. You have to take the step to make that happen. Let me give you an example. A long time ago, in a land far, far away, lived a good king and queen who had 3 sons. And one day, to their alarm, their youngest son became sick, so sick that his parents feared he might die. So they sent out word to the whole land, look for a doctor who will be able to come and administer to our son and save his life. Well, I don't know if you care or not about that story. I hope you do. I hope you want to know what's going to happen next. But I don't know, because I made that up for the purposes of illustrating this point. Let me try and be a little bit more scientific. I'm going to read an extract from a journal about someone in a persistent vegetative state. And it starts like this. In July 2005, a 23-year-old woman sustained a severe traumatic brain injury as a result of a road traffic accident. 5 months later, she remained unresponsive with preserved sleep-wake cycles. Clinical assessment by a multidisciplinary team concluded that she fulfilled all of the criteria for a diagnosis of vegetative state according to international guidelines. We used functional magnetic resonance imaging to measure her neural responses during the presentation of spoken sentences, which were compared with responses to acoustically matched noise sequences. Speech-specific activity was observed bilaterally in the middle and superior temporal gyri, equivalent to that observed in healthy volunteers listening to the same stimuli. Now, it seems to me that that's a perfectly all right description. I can't hear anything wrong with that, but with my untrained ear, of course. But it's not how a storyteller would do it. A storyteller would work much harder at drawing us in and making us care. So here's an article from the Scientific American written by a science journalist who, of course, is a storyteller, because all good journalists are. I can trace my search for consciousness in non-responsive patients to the moment in 1997 when I met Kate, a young teacher from Cambridge, England, who had lapsed into a coma after a flu-like illness. Within a few weeks, Kate's doctors had declared her to be vegetative, meaning that although she had sleep-wake cycles, she lacked conscious awareness. Her eyes would open and close, and she would appear to look fleetingly around the hospital room, but showed no signs of inner life and no responses to prompting by her family or her doctors. Now, that's how a storyteller does it. They make you care. Let's have a look at the idea of plot. Nobody is interested in a story where everything stays the same or everything is just pretty good. What happens in the average plot is that someone's life is going on like this. Then something happens pretty bad, pretty catastrophic, and their life goes down, as it were, and they have to figure out a way to try and get back. They have to find some strength in themselves or find companionship or whatever that will bring them back up. Nobody is interested in stories where nothing changes and everything is pretty good. That's fairly boring. Lots of plots follow the pattern of the bog standard screenplay. And I'm going to give you a crash course in how to write a screenplay for a bog standard commercial movie, successful movie. Now, don't worry, I know that none of you have signed up in order to learn how to write screenplays, so we won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's very illustrative. And you'll see what I mean when I begin to explain how this thing is structured. So the average film, the kinds of films that buyers know will sell anyway, is about 120 minutes long. So 2 hours long. And the idea is this: after 10 minutes, you really do need to know what kind of a film this is. The audience must not be confused anymore about what kind of a film it is, what they've let themselves in for, what the setup is, the situation, and who is the main character through whose eyes we see the action, who the hero or heroine is that we are identifying with. At 30 minutes in, something happens to catapult our main character into some life-changing experience, something which demands that his or her world changes. And from there on in, there's usually a kind of rise and fall. So our hero and his girlfriend are thrown into a pyramid full of snakes. Oh dear, but they get out. A little bit later on, they need to steal an aeroplane. But oh dear, they have a big fight, or our hero has a big fight with the pilot of the aeroplane. But hey, never mind, they triumph, they overcome, and they escape. And so it goes on, the rise and fall, until at about 90 minutes into the film, we reach the peak, the maximum jeopardy, the worst situation that our hero or heroine can be in. And from then on, things start to resolve. We have, and there's a lot of French language in filmmaking, we have the denouement. And from that 90-minute peak of absolute desperation, there's a reverse rise and fall, there's a downwards rise and fall, as it were, towards the conclusion, hopefully the satisfying conclusion of the film, when all the ends are tied up and where our hero is vindicated. Now, the other thing that's going on is that all the way through that rise and fall of tension, and then the peak, and then the denouement, all the way through that process, which begins at 30 minutes in, usually, our character is changing. They themselves are changing. They're discovering skills that they didn't have. They're renewing skills. There's a gunslinger who has become the sheriff, and the sheriff has nothing to do, and so over time he's become old, and he's become overweight, and he's become drunk, and some bad guys come into town, and now the townspeople turn to the former gunslinger who's their sheriff and say, we need your help, what's going to happen? And a lot of bad things will happen along the way, until our formerly gunslinger sheriff gets himself sober, gets out on the gun range practicing shooting those bottles with his Smith & Wesson, and eventually recovers the skills that he once had, and found his bravery, his courage, and his wits in order to defeat the bad guys. Well, that's a very good example of growth through a story. And one of the things that we enjoy is feeling that we've grown, whether that's growing in knowledge or realization, or it makes us think about good choices that we ought to make, or courageous choices that we ought to make. We enjoy that. We enjoy the sense that we too have gone on this journey, and we've learnt a lot. Now, the good news for anybody working in science is that science has a natural story structure to it. Well, if you're doing research, it has a natural story structure to it. I mean, if you think about a PhD, what happens in a PhD? Well, with a PhD, you invent a problem. You find a problem. And you then have to investigate something, and things will stand in your way. They will frustrate you. They will irritate you. You will have to find ways around. You want something, but you are thwarted. Nobody ever earned a PhD by doing something astonishingly easy. It's hard to find stuff out. It's hard to resolve mysteries. It's hard to figure out what's really going on. It's hard to overcome obstacles and invent new ways of finding things out. And that's what makes it worthwhile. But it is a natural story structure. Storytellers know that you have to make decisions if you're going to hold people's attention, what you're going to put in and what you're going to take out. Storytellers, if they were representing a day in the life of somebody, would just chop out all the boring bits. There are some days, if they did that to me, there would be absolutely nothing to show at all. Alfred Hitchcock said, film is real life with the boring bits taken out. So storytellers essentially direct our attention to those things that they have chosen to show us. You might indicate that there are interesting things elsewhere, but they are not being dealt with now. What we're focusing on is this. Let me give you an example. Imagine you'd organised a walk with some friends in a national park, and all your friends gather, and you announce that your plan is that on this walk you're going to touch every single tree in the national park. People would not enjoy that very much, and I don't think they'd play with you. You would normally make a choice, and you would have to say, well, if we take the path on the left, then that leads round to a really nice lake, and there's a picnic area and things that we can do there by the water. If we took the right-hand path, and that leads up into a rocky pass, and eventually you can get to a place where you can look over the city. And that all sounds great. We could argue about which way we wanted to go, but in the end we would have to make a choice. And storytellers are always making choices and directing our attention to certain things. The great Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, when he gave his lectures, would often say things like this. He would say, well, if you put the numbers into this equation, these are the numbers that pop out at the other side. Now, if you want to find out about that, you can. But he wouldn't deal with that on that occasion because he didn't want to slow the action. He wanted to focus the attention of his audience on a particular thing. Storytellers are always making choices. It's part of the very important editorial process. You can't imagine a good story without plenty of surprises. Actually, great stories are often one surprise after another. And of course, immediately we can think about plots with twists and turns where we go, wow, that's amazing. I had no idea that she was the murderer or that he was the culprit. I never imagined that they would do this or that they would do that. But there's another aspect to surprise as well, in that it's really part of a deep quality of storytelling, not just some dramatic incident that's dropped in every now and again, but that the storyteller has taken the trouble to find fresh ways to say things. Think about this. If you are having a conversation with somebody, you don't require that every few moments they tell you something absolutely mind-blowing. That would be extremely weird. But actually, we do get a little bit bored if we can predict exactly what they're going to say and how the conversation is going to go. The same with a presentation. A really simple example of this is if you show bullet points on a slide, on a PowerPoint slide, for example, and you put the whole slide, all the bullet points up on one slide. People read to the end and they're done. There are no surprises to come. So as a matter of routine, I always try and build my bullet points on slides. And that's a kind of storytelling device. Finding fresh ways to say things, unusual approaches, and surprising people in gentle ways is also the stock in trade of the storyteller. David Mamet, the famous American playwright and screenwriter, said this when he was asked, what's the secret of writing a compelling screenplay? He said this: the only thing that keeps the audience in its seat is wondering what is going to happen next. Quite often in my workshops, when I get people to list the features of a good story, people will say humour. And I have to disagree because there are a great many great stories, that are completely humourless. They don't have one joke in them from beginning to end, but they still hold our attention. But because it's such a prominent thing, humour, we know lots of good communicators, good science communicators, who are funny people. I just want to say something about it. And my rules are these. First of all, you do not have to be funny in order to be a great communicator. That's rule number one. That's true. So if you're anxious that you're not funny, don't worry. Secondly, you do have a sense of humour. If you've laughed at anything today, you have a sense of humour. And the issue is, what is your sense of humour? How does it work? Find your own sense of humour. And thirdly, you need to play with it. And you need to take some risks. One of the great things about being a presenter is if you tell a joke, if you say something which you think is funny and people don't laugh, then you can just keep going. My advice is never in your mind or on a script ever have a little place which says pause for laughter. Because people may not laugh and there'll be a deafening silence and it will really throw you. I always treat laughter with a live audience as a bonus. If people laugh at something I've said, then I relax and I enjoy that they're laughing. If they don't laugh, I just keep talking. Humour is a great tool, but don't be overwhelmed by some strange requirement that you have to use it in your presentations. A couple of years ago, I was delighted to get the commission to make some films to celebrate the 20th anniversary of FENS. Actually, I was also tasked with documenting the comments and the recollections, the memories of all the officers of FENS, and some from ENA as well before it. Now, it was great for me to get the commission and to work on that project, and I enjoyed doing it. But for the purposes of this workshop, I want you to think for a moment about the prospect of doing that. Where does the storytelling come in? Imagine me talking to my friends and my colleagues about what I'm currently doing. You know, we're always talking about what projects are you working on now? You know, is it to do with sharks or what? You know, and I would say, well, I'm working for a neuroscience organisation, a big neuroscience organisation in Europe, and they say, "Oh, okay." And wow, that must be really interesting. So what? It's neuroscience. So you're looking at new research into the brain. And I go, not really. Well, what is it then? Well, it's about an organisation. Okay, it's an organisation of neuroscience societies. Okay, and so what's the story then? Well. It turned from one organisation into another organisation. Now, you can see that in prospect, that's quite daunting. I, of course, was delighted to discover the stories behind FENS, but I had to think hard about how to approach this. So I've taken the liberty of including in this workshop one of the films. It's about the beginning of FENS. You may have seen it. If you haven't, it's on the FENS website with the others. Short plug there. And I'm hoping that you will see that it illustrates some of the key elements of storytelling.
I was there at the beginning of ENA. I'd seen the whole history, the rise and the fall of ENA. But it was not a fall, it was a metamorphosis into even better.
People felt European. It was the dawn of the European era at that time. And it needed structure. And this is why we did it.
Wolf Singer was the most pronounced initiator of now it is the time that we move. From then on, we stopped talking and did things.
Because there was this other structure, ENA, European Neuroscience Association, which was a single member society, which means you were an individual member at ENA. So you had two memberships. You were a member of ENA and you were a member of the National Society. And ENA became less and less important while the National Societies grew up and became stronger.
At that time, we started to realize that more Europeans were going to the American meeting than to the European meeting. And that created a bit of a panic. We were very lucky to get Helmut Kettermann on board because he was convinced that we have to give us a one-time chance to get going.
Because what we wanted was just restructuring and harmonize overall the neuroscience activities in Europe. And this was not done before because we had member societies that were not collaborating at the same table. And this was our first goal.
The other bold action was that Kettermann said that we can't use a professional congress organizer when we are so small. We had also to be much more professional.
So this was really structuring platforms that could be attractive for our community to get together and to stay together and to generate a critical mass that could raise neuroscience in Europe.
I mean, there were anxieties about this. You know, would people come? Many of us had a belief that this was so obviously needed that it couldn't possibly fail. But then that should have been the case with the European Neuroscience Association meetings beforehand. So could it be made to be different?
Kettermann's idea was to electrify the meeting in a way that hadn't been done before. And one should be aware of that. He took personally, as a director of his institute, clear risks of an economic failure, because the ENA didn't have the resources to, no buffer. And if the meeting in Berlin failed, he would have been sitting there with a debt that I know he said he had no idea of how he should cover.
We had a scenario of 1,000 where we would have a really major loss. We had a scenario of about 2,000 where we just were breaking even. And then we had a scenario of 2,500 where we are in a comfortable zone. And people were really skeptical whether we would get 2,500 people there. In the end, it was 4,000.
I think the willingness of all these societies through their presidents to join this venture brought along with it a kind of missionary enthusiasm, encouraging people to attend, such that when the numbers started registering for the FENS Forum, we realized that even though we had a space that was much bigger than we'd ever used before for a meeting, it wasn't enough. And Helmut Kettenmann, I remember, had to hastily arrange a marquee that had to be put up in the grounds of the hotel so we could have posters, because there were so many free communications and so many posters all squashed into this space.
Which was awful, because it was July, it was hot, everything was cramped, and people were just, there were just too many people for that space. And but on the other hand, nobody expected that, so people kind of coped with it in a way. During that event, we didn't feel anything. We were so completely under stress during that time because we had organized it, basically. There was no professional organization behind it.
We were very young and we were just trying to make this happening with our time, our resources. I think that the excitation in those days were fantastic.
And I think at that moment, there was a feeling, there was a buzz and excitement. This really could work. And the numbers then drifted up and up, to 6,000 plus over the next 4 or 5 forums.
That period was really the starting of FENS. So it was full of enthusiasm because we were all engaged in a sort of a pioneering activity.
It very quickly established itself on the calendar as being not only a European meeting where European neuroscience was being showcased and where networking and collaborative interactions could be formed, but a truly international meeting as well. So I've been able to see how this grand experiment of establishing a federation has had its growing pains and has begun to consolidate, and I now feel is through adolescence and is a mature organization which provides real value to European neuroscientists.
So I'm often asked to recommend books about storytelling, and I have got hundreds of books about storytelling, but they all come from different contexts. I have a background in program making, so I'm interested in radio, making television, podcasts, film, all that kind of thing. And so I have books about screenwriting and directing, all that kind of stuff. I'm interested in writing too, and I've got storytelling approaches by writers. But I've dug out 3 books that you might find interesting, I think, so as not to overwhelm you with stuff in an already busy life. So the first book I want to recommend is Robert McKee's Story. This is the distillation of his many famous workshops all about screenwriting. And it looks at the substance, structure, style and principles of screenwriting, but it's all about stories and storytelling. And I think anybody who is in a position, whether as a presenter or as a writer or an event creator, and who wants to understand something about stories would glean a lot from this. The second one is by a journalist, social commentator, ghostwriter, Will Storr, and it's just called The Science of Storytelling. by Will Storr. And this book is a fascinating reflection on the nature of stories, the power of stories, how stories work, how they have their influence upon us, and what we can learn to help make us better communicators. And the last one I picked is a lot of fun. It's by Randy Olson. Now, Randy Olson went to Harvard, ended up as a professor of marine biology, and then he decided he wanted to become a filmmaker. And he put the two things together, his science career and his communication career as a filmmaker, in this book, and it's called Don't Be Such a Scientist. What a fantastic title is that, Don't Be Such a Scientist. And he's interested in the conflict between the principles of communicating well and the way in which scientists usually communicate. Now, I know an awful lot of scientists do communicate well, but he says sometimes scientists fall over their own bootstraps because they don't understand certain principles about being received by a bigger, wider audience, about influencing a wider audience. He's got a chapter in this book called Don't Be Such a Poor Storyteller. And it's worth the price of the book, but there's an awful lot to stimulate you there. It's a very gentle kick in the bottom for scientists about being better communicators. Well, we're very close to the end of our workshop on storytelling. Thank you for coming through this with me. I hope you found it stimulating and interesting. I hope also that it's inspired you to think about the role of storytelling in your own communication, in your own presentations. Years ago, I remember driving in London, quite near the famous Oval cricket ground. And it was a rather dark, miserable night. It was raining quite heavily. And I stopped the car at some traffic lights, and looking over to my left, I could see some people huddled in a bus stop, waiting for the next bus and just trying to stay dry underneath the small metal awning that covered them. And then I became aware that on the other side of the road, there was a man with a megaphone. And he was dressed in rain clothes, and he had his megaphone, and he was shouting as loud as he possibly could various religious encouragements to these people. And I remember thinking, this is the very essence of absurdity. Here is somebody who is saying stuff, shouting very loudly down his megaphone, but completely failing to connect and to communicate with his target audience. Storytelling is the key to connecting with audiences. And scientists, of course, have to deal with some extremely complicated material, and they have to state their findings very precisely. But in other arenas and in other places, it is possible to employ the art of storytelling to engage people who would normally be way beyond the reach of anything that you have to say. And this is magical. The last piece of advice I want to give you about storytelling is to become a connoisseur of storytelling. I have my storytelling heroes, people that I like to listen to. I think, for example, of the great Neil deGrasse Tyson in the United States and the incredible work that he's done in terms of communicating science. In my own country, people like Brian Cox and Alice Roberts, and actually hundreds of others, have communicated science beautifully through their television programs and through their writings, because they are good storytellers. And so my final encouragement is to become a connoisseur of good storytelling. Don't just enjoy what these people are saying, but look at how they do it. Look at the elements of storytelling that they employ. Look at the way they present material. Look at what they leave out. Look at their use of all the storytelling devices that we have been talking about. By being a connoisseur, we will open the door to enriching our own abilities and capacities to enthrall others with the stories of science.